Hello, welcome back. In this video, we will talk about preparing the data for analysis with Power BI. And we have a co-passenger called DBAT who may be asking questions on behalf of you. If you have just started working with Power BI, this video will help you understand getting data from different sources. If you plan to appear for Microsoft certification exam on Power BI, this video covers the topics under module 1 of Prepare the Data section. The section called Prepare the Data accounts nearly to 25 to 30% of the entire course content. And once you complete this video and confirming that you are clear about all the points discussed, then you have completed 10% of your learning path. We are talking about preparing the data, for which the first step is to get the data, and data can be obtained from different sources including flat files. A flat file is a type of file that has only one data table and every row of data is in the same structure. They don't have hierarchies. A few common examples of flat files are CSV files, text files, Excel files. What is more important for a beginner is the file location. If it is in a local drive, you need to refresh your Power BI often when it is published. Had it been from cloud, refresh automatically happens at predefined intervals. We'll be talking about publishing a report to Power BI services in some other video. Anyways, this is just an heads up for you. You may have to change the location of a source file for a data source during development, or if a file storage location changes. To keep your reports up to date, you will need to update your file connection path in Power BI, and that can be done in 3 different places. And one of them is known as data source settings, and the other one is called the query settings, and the third place is called advanced editor. If you are changing a file path, make sure that you reconnect to the same file with the same file structure. Any structural changes to your file, such as deleting or renaming columns in the source file, will break the reporting model. We have a question from DBAT. Which out of these 3 methods will be easier for a beginner? To check that, we will quickly move to a demo now. I have a plain new Power BI file kept open in my desktop. Before doing anything in this file, let me click on the Transform Data drop-down menu and then select Data Source Settings. I want you to make a note of a place called Global Permissions, which currently says you don't have any permissions saved on this computer. Similarly, data sources in current file, we didn't find any data sources in this file. Yes, Raja, that is quite obvious. We have not connected to any data sources. So as of now, this is an empty Power BI file. All right, let us get data from an Excel file called sample1. I'm going to get data from a table called Asia, and the Asia table is now loaded into my Power Query editor as a query. And in applied steps, I'll be able to click on a place called source, wherein I'll be able to see from where the file is being picked up. The path of the file is visible in the formula bar. Similarly, in the advanced editor, I'll be able to see the same information. I'm going to hit close and apply so that the data is now loaded into the model. I can quickly create a card visual to highlight the total profit. I have created this card visual just for the purpose of a demonstration. The sample1 Excel file from where we obtained some data is now going to be moved from the current location to a folder. So it is now moved to a folder called the CSN folder. Of course, the folder is still kept inside the desktop. If I go back to my Power BI file, will there be any problem for me at this point of time? There is less likely to be any problem at this point of time. However, when I try to hit refresh, assuming that there are some data changes or I want to check whether there is any data change, I am now encountering a problem. Could not find the file. That is obvious, Raja, you have moved the file to a different location. Okay, how do we correct this issue? I can go back to my Power Query editor by hitting transform data. I spoke about 2 places. One is called the source here, wherein I will be able to make some changes here. Or I can click on the advanced editor and I can make a change here. Both of them may be slightly difficult for the first time user, and therefore I'm going to speak about another method, another place called data source settings. When I hit that, I'm now able to see the first discussion, global permission and the data sources in the current file. Data sources in current file now speaks about initially Raja has picked up information from a file called sample1 which was kept in desktop. However, it has now been moved to a different location, and it is the duty of Raja to change the source and confirm that this file is now moved to a folder called CSN and reconnect that to my Power BI. Click OK, click close. You can just click on close and apply. The table is once again loaded and things are back to normal. I would like to also highlight that the transform data option in the Power BI screen also contains data source settings, from where also you can do the same job of changing the source if it is required. Let me now speak about getting data from a JSON file, JavaScript object notation file, for which I need to click on get data and then choose the more option and then select the JSON file format. Click connect, and in my desktop I do have a JSON file. Then I'm just going to choose that and I'm able to get the data visible in my Power Query editor. Dbot comes into picture to give us a hint that we are going to talk about something else, and that is correct. We are now going to speak about global permissions. When you install Power BI and start working with it in your computer for the first time, the global permissions tab may not show any permissions saved on your computer. However, when I speak about connecting to a SQL source, I may have to authenticate myself, which can happen in either of the three possible methods: Windows-based authentication, database-based authentication, or through Microsoft account. Similarly, if I'm talking about getting data from a SharePoint folder or maybe SharePoint online list, once again, I need to authenticate myself in any one of the three possible methods, either as anonymous user or Windows-based credentials or through my Microsoft account. Once again, if I'm going to connect to my Azure Cosmos DB account, no SQL account, I may have to key in my URL and then provide my account key. And if I'm going to successfully authenticate myself, those credentials are going to be stored in the global permissions. And you will not be required to authenticate yourself again if you connect to the same source for your next Power BI project. So this is what we are going to practically learn within next few minutes. And then we will speak about how do we modify the permission or clear the permission and so on. I have another plain new Power BI file, and I am going to show you the global permissions is still empty. For this demonstration, I am going to get data from a SQL server. I have my SQL server installed in this laptop, and I am now using a SQL Server Management Studio to show you the name of the database called CSN, in which I have a table called sales data, and I am going to pull the data. Back to my Power BI file, I need to provide the name of my server here and the name of the database. Of course, it is optional. More importantly, we need to now learn about data connectivity mode, either as import or direct query. Hey Raja, when you get data from Excel file, you have never spoken about this connectivity mode. Correct. By default, from a flat file, you get the data in import mode, which means a local copy of the file's data will be saved as a snapshot at that point of time within your Power BI file. However, when I speak about a SQL Server database, I can decide whether to import the entire data into my Power BI, thereby increasing the size of the file, or can I use an option called direct query, in which only the schema will be brought here and the physical data will be still maintained within the SQL Server database. For this example, I am going to use the option called import. I am going to click OK, and now I am expected to authenticate myself, because this is the first time I am connecting to a SQL Server in this computer. I am going to use my current credentials, click connect, and I would like to accept this message that encryption support is not available at this point of time. Fine with me. And now my navigator window will open all the databases within my SQL Server, and I am talking about one database called CSN, within which I am talking about one particular table called sales data. Click on transform data. I can now see Power Query editor showing me all the columns from the SQL Server. I'm just going to hit close and apply, nothing less, nothing more. Close to about 1 million rows are now loaded into my model. Let us now check this global permission. Then you will be able to see that a permission has been granted for a SQL server called SQL Express as a local host. And from that particular SQL server, I have obtained some data from within a database called CSN. So data source in current file is very specific about the current source of the data, whereas global permission simply says, look Raja, you have authenticated yourself. Okay. However, there could be a scenario in which I may have to change my password once in 30 days or once in 45 days, in which case I can click on edit permission, and then the credentials I can click on edit, and then I can change it here also. Please also make a note that there is something called a privacy level, which is very important, which currently says none. Depending upon your working environment, you may be required to change it from none to public or organizational or private. In this demonstration, I am not going to do anything here, but I want you to make a keen note of privacy level whenever you connect to any data source that needs authentication. Okay, global permission is now available in my laptop for SQL Express, which means that I may not be required to authenticate myself again if I am trying to get data from this particular SQL server, and that is going to be pretty useful. Let us now check about getting data from a SharePoint online list. In your screen, you will be able to see a SharePoint site. I'm just going to copy the URL of this, and I'm going to show you a list here called sales data, which I want to pull into Power BI. I just need to check my column names, which will be required for me to be used. So this is a SharePoint online list. Going back to my Power BI file, click on get data, choosing the option called SharePoint online list. Click connect and paste my URL. Click OK. Once again, I am expected to authenticate myself. For a flat file, it may not be needed, but for a SQL server, it was required. We just saw that. Now I am trying to get data from my SharePoint folder. It also needs authentication. I would like to make use of my Microsoft account mechanism. Would like to click on sign in to authenticate myself, choosing the account, and I have authenticated myself. Click connect. You'll be able to see my SharePoint site. I'm talking about one particular data called sales data. Click transform data, and then you'll be able to see quite a number of additional columns which are nothing but metadata. SharePoint always creates data about data that is known as a metadata. I may not need all of them to be loaded, so I can make use of an option called choose columns, and then uncheck this option called select all columns, then identify only those columns that I need, and then click OK. So whatever is required by me has been obtained. Let us now check the global permissions. So as expected, the connection to my SharePoint online list is also recorded here as a global permission. Once again, I can hit on edit permissions in case I want to change the credentials, or if I'm not going to connect to my SharePoint folder anymore in this computer in future, I can also clear permissions, which means that I may have to authenticate again the next time if I'm going to clear that. We have identified that when I try to connect to a SQL server or SharePoint online after successful authentication, the information is stored as a global permission. As intimated already, you may be required to change the permission once in a while whenever your organization policy is to change the password frequently, or you may be required to clear permissions sometimes. So if you clear the permission, then you need to authenticate again when you try to connect to the same source. So that is the end of our discussions about global permissions. I believe all of you watching this video can also understand what exactly is the purpose of global permissions. Debot is very clear. Okay, Raja, I think you are now going to talk about something else. We have a long way to go, correct? I'm now going to talk about exporting your global permission as a PBIDS file. If you need to frequently connect to a data source, which involves a few steps, such as clicking the get data and then choosing a source type and then choosing your source location and so on, you can convert all these set of actions into a PBIDS file. Let us dive into action, understand the concept, and then we move to the next one. Prior to that, I'm just going to show you a couple of information about a PBIDS file, which you can come back and read. Let me now demonstrate the need for creating a PBIDS file. Let us say I want to connect to my SQL Server database again. I can hit SQL Server, then need to provide my server name, and then need to click OK. I'm not required to authenticate because that is what global permission is taking care of. I may have to choose a CSN database. I may have to choose a table from here. So this step I keep on doing whenever I want to connect to my SQL source. Or if I want to get data from my SharePoint Online, again I have to click on a couple of steps. So I need to perform all these steps. Again I need to copy and paste the URL and so on. To avoid these steps, in case if I need to keep on working from same external sources of data, I can open my data source settings and I can choose either from the current file or from the global permission, though both of them are slightly different. Let me choose the data sources in current file option, which is going to open your SharePoint Online, then connect you to a particular SharePoint site. If I'm going to call it as export PBIDS, it says MSO365 global sharepoint.com.pbids, which can be stored in my desktop. I can save that. Similarly, I can click on the second option in which I'll be connected to my SQL server. Not only that, I'll be getting a database called CSN. So let me also save this. This I'm going to make a small change in the name for our understanding. I just call it as CSN. Now for the SQL server, I'm going to hit on global permission where you don't see a specific database called CSN is selected. I'm going to export this also into a PBIDS file. This is called a local host. So all these files are now getting loaded into my desktop. I'm going to close this option now. What I have done, I have created 3 PBIDS files. What is the purpose of that? Let us go to desktop, check one of them. This is called a local host. When I try to open that, it opens a PowerBI file, connects to your SQL server and shows all the possible databases over there. So this is pretty useful because I need not have to mention my SQL server's name again and again. I'm just going to cancel this, going to click on CSN. So this PBIDS file is a very specific one which straight away opens my SQL server and straight away opens my database called CSN so that my task is even more simplified. I can now choose whichever table I want, then I can work on. I will also show you the SharePoint PBIDS file, which is expected to open my SharePoint online list without even me pasting the URL and all that. There you go. It has clearly opened the SharePoint site and then I can choose my table from there as per my requirement. So this is what is a PBIDS file, which can save a lot of your time if you are going to frequently use such external data sources. Okay, let us now begin a new topic. This topic is more focused on getting data from a relational database, such as a SQL server. I have a database called CSN and a table called sales data with columns such as region, country, item type, and so on. Dbot is asking a question. Raja, can I exclude a few columns while I bring the data from SQL Server to Power BI? Because that will reduce the size of my model if I can avoid columns that I will not be using in my reports. That is a pretty good question. And while you are trying to get data from a SQL Server, you can write a SQL statement such as you see in the screen, a select statement, in which you can clearly define the columns that you want to bring from a particular table. You may now ask me another question. I don't know SQL. What should I do? You can initially get all the columns. In the Power Query editor, you can remove any column that you don't need. Go to the applied steps, right click on the last action, click on View Native Query, and then you can see the code equivalent of a SQL query. There is a concept called query folding. If you can create a view in your SQL server that can be used to retrieve the data. If Power BI uses a view when it retrieves data, it participates in query folding, a feature of Power Query. Dbot is asking a question. Can you show how to create a view? Yes, we can see a demo. If you have access to a SQL Server through SQL Server Management Studio, you can also perform the activity. If you don't have access, please comment it in this channel. I can respond you with the details regarding installing a SQL Server to get hands-on exposure, or will guide you to use some virtual machines. Dbot is asking another question, which will be a best option? Should I write a SQL code while I try to pull data from a SQL server, or shall I pull the entire data and then remove unwanted columns so that Power Query editor can do the job of creating a native query that can be understood by the SQL server, or should I create a view in the SQL server and use it to retrieve data? So you will have the correct answer at the end of this demonstration. And finally, we should also understand about three different types of storage modes you can choose from, called import, direct query, or dual. The import mode allows you to create a local Power BI copy of your data sets, and it is ideal to use all the Power BI features. However, data refreshes must be done manually. Import mode is the default mode for creating new Power BI reports. The direct query option is useful when you do not want to save local copies of your data because your data will not be cached. For security reasons, many organizations will prefer to keep the data in the SQL Server and show only the results in the reports. There is yet another mode called dual mode, in which you can identify some data to be directly imported and other data that must be queried. Any table that is brought into your report is a product of both import and direct query modes. Using the dual modes allows Power BI to choose the most efficient form of data retrieval. All right, with this introduction, let us now move on to a practical demo on the topics we have discussed so far. We have a database called CSN and a table called sales data within that database. There are a few columns, as you can see in the screen, in this particular table called sales data, and we prefer to pull data only from country column, item type, date, and the profit. We want to exclude rest of the columns. To do that in Power BI, I start with clicking this option called import data from SQL Server, and then provide the name of my server as well as my database, and click on advanced options to write my SQL statement. I'm going to start with a select. Select is a very popular SQL statement. Then I'm going to say I want to get the country column. Then I want to get the item type column. Because there is a space between the words item and type, I need to keep them within double quotes. I need the date column, and then I need the profit column from a table called sales data. So this is a simple SQL statement that I can write in my Power BI screen that will now be conveyed to the database called CSN once I am successfully connected, and then retrieve only those columns. Click OK. And now I could see exactly what I want. I am able to see only the 4 columns that I want to use in my reports, and the same is achieved by writing a SQL query in my Power BI screen. Let me cancel this. Let me click on import data from SQL Server once again, provide the name of server and database, but I am not going to write any code here. I am going to simply click OK. And from the navigator window, I am going to choose sales data table. Click on transform data. In the Power Query editor, I'm going to remove columns that I don't need. I don't need region column. I don't need the sales channel. I don't need the order priority. I can right click and remove columns. The earlier example, this job was done through the SQL query. Only 4 columns were retrieved from the SQL Server. In this example, many columns were retrieved, but some of them were removed in Power Query editor. So when you hover your cursor to the applied steps area, look at the last action called remove columns. Right click, you will be able to see view native query, and when you open that, you will be able to see a simple select query is written by Power Query itself. This also says select the so-and-so columns from a database object called sales data, which is considered to be a table. Okay, so this information will hereafter be conveyed to your SQL server whenever you add data or whenever you want to refresh data. Only these 4 columns will be retrieved from there. Alright, Raja, now we have a date column here, and is it possible for me to convert this into only date, because currently it is showing date and time? That is also possible. I'm just going to click on the data type icon in the column header, and I prefer to change this to plain date format. That is done. Now, in the applied steps, you can see yet another step being recorded called changed type. Right click on view native query. Now you can see that the previous native query has expanded itself to accommodate one more activity. That activity is convert the date and time column into plain date. Okay, so if all the activities that you perform in the Power Query editor can be converted into a single select statement, that is called query folding. There are a few steps that will not participate in query folding. We will talk about that a bit later. As a beginner, just get an idea. If all the steps that you perform in your Power Query editor can be converted into a single select statement, that is called query folding. Alright, Raja, what next? I'm going to cancel this also. I'm not going to load the data from here. Discard changes, because now we are going to speak about the third option which we will be doing in our SQL server. So I am inside my sales data table within my CSN database, and I am trying to check the button called views. Right click and then try to create a new view for the table called sales data. And then I am going to put a tick mark or check the boxes for country, item type, date and profit. In the first example, you wrote a select query in the Power BI. The second example, Power Query editor created TSQL statements that can be understood by the SQL server. The third example, I am using an option called creating a view, which is kind of user friendly. I'm just clicking on whatever columns I need, and I can see in the bottom window that is converted to a SQL code. I need to save this to be used by Power BI to retrieve data. I just call this as a part 5 sample. Click OK. We can in fact create a complex queries using view very easily. Maybe you can give a try sometime later. Let me now go back to Power BI. Try to import data from SQL Server. Provide the name of the server, the name of the database. Click OK. And this time I'm going to use a view which only shows me the selected columns. Transform data, and there you are. Let me click on close and apply. Now you can see the data loaded, and you will be able to see a physical copy of the data here. We have 1 million rows of data loaded here for the selected columns. Import mode will bring a physical copy of your data from your SQL Server to your Power BI file. Alternatively, you can use a mode called direct query, in which you are going to see a major difference. Perform the same action once again. The only difference is I am going to click on the option called direct query, then click OK, then choose the view, click on transform data, just confirming that all the columns required are available, close and apply. And you can now see still all those information are loaded, but the physical copy is not available here. You don't see the data option, data icon available in your screen. However, the data is readily available. For example, if I'm going to create a card and then pull the profit value, I'll be able to see a result within seconds. So where is the data? The data is safely sitting in your SQL server, and you will be creating reports here without touching the data. This may be useful for many organizations on 2 reasons. Number 1, they have a huge amount of data and they don't want to load everything into Power BI, which will increase the size of the model. Number 2, data security. Your data is not brought here as a local copy. There may be an occasion where you may temporarily need this data to be a local copy. In the model space, I'm now showing you an option called advanced, in which the storage mode is direct query. Yes, Raja, that is right. We brought this data as a direct query mode. However, you have an option to now change this to a dual mode or import mode. Okay, I'm just going to click on dual. Setting the storage mode to the dual has the following implications. Please consider them carefully before proceeding. I'm good to go with that. Click OK. Now you can see a change in the line and the storage mode is set to dual. Now I'll be able to see the physical copy of the data present here. The data tab works. I'll be able to see the physical copy. You may now ask me a question. Raja, can I go back to my direct query mode from dual? Pretty much possible. You can click on direct query, click OK. There you go. You don't see the data table options anymore here. There is no physical copy of your data. This way, you can switch between direct query and dual. And more about the use of dual, we will be discussing in a future video. As of now, you might have received answers for your questions. So what will be a good way to pull data from a SQL server if I have a huge amount of data? Should I write a SQL code in Power BI? Not a good idea. Can I do all the transformations in Power Query Editor? Again, not a good idea. Can I create a view in a SQL Server itself? That is the best idea. When you click on transform data, you will be able to see native query. So whenever you are able to see a native query, that source is permitting you to use the concept called query folding, which will be very useful when you think about large data models. With this, our discussion on getting data from a relational database using different methods is over, and we can move to the next topic. Okay, let us begin a new topic. In previous examples, we have decided not to load specific columns which are not required in the report, and we have identified methods to exclude such columns. Either by creating a view or by writing a SQL query, we can limit the columns that will be loaded to Power BI. However, what should be done if I need to limit the values in a specific column? For example, let us say you have a column called country, which may have hundreds of country names, but you want to show the reports only for one particular country at any point of time. That is a place where you need to think about creating a dynamic report with parameters. Dynamic reports are reports in which the data can be changed by a developer according to user specifications. Dynamic reports are valuable because a single report can be used for multiple purposes. You can create a dynamic report with a parameter after watching the demo, and you can come back to this section of the video, pause it and read it if you want to read the steps one by one. Let us now create a dynamic report using parameter. I have a plain Power BI file kept open, and I would like to get data from a SQL server from a database called CSN. Would like to make use of the import option. I'm choosing the sales data table, transform data. In the Power Query, I'm able to see all the columns. When I click on close and apply, the data is now loaded. All the columns, all the rows of data are now loaded. To quickly show you how many rows of data that were loaded, I open the table view and we can see many countries here, and 1 million rows were loaded into the model. The previous example, we were talking about reducing the model size by limiting the number of columns. In this example, we are going to think about one specific column is needed, but not all the rows in that column is needed. All right, let us go back to Power Query Editor, and our focus is on the country column, where I want to reduce the number of rows because I want to see the report for only one country at a given point of time. Choose the country column, right click, add as new query, and then click on the option called remove duplicates. So I have just created a query, and the query is named as country. Now let me go back to my sales data query and then click on manage parameters, then click on new parameter. Would like to create a parameter called PARAM, stands for param, country. I'm going to choose only one country using this parameter. And the type of this parameter should be a text value, which should be fetched from a query that I have recently created and called as country. Let us say the current value I want to see is called India. Click OK. And now you have created a parameter called the param country, which is holding a current value called India. So this is the first step. The second step, I go to my sales data query. For the first instance, filter the country column manually for India. And then I could see in the formula bar the M code equivalent of the action. So this value called India is now hard coded. I can also open my advanced editor and I can see it there. In the third step, I can see each country equals India. India is within double quotes. I'm going to remove that. Then I start typing PAR. I can see my parameter called a param country. And now the hard coded value called India is replaced with the parameter I have created. I'm going to click on done. Now you can see in the formula bar also the hard coded value called India has been replaced with the text string called param country. There is a list called country here that I don't want to be loaded into my model. So I'm going to say enable load. I'm going to uncheck this option. Sales data table is what I want. So I'm going to click on close and apply. Now you can see a limited amount of rows were loaded into the model. Let us have a quick check on that. Now you can see the only country for which data has been loaded is called India. Previously we had 1 million rows loaded. Now it is only 5470 rows. 5470 rows. Everything looks to be good, Raja. But you mentioned in the beginning that the user will be able to decide the country for which he wants to see the report. And currently you have loaded the data only for a country called India. What will happen if the user wants to see the report for a different country? When you click on the drop down menu from transform data, you will be able to see a place called edit parameters. Click. And the param country parameter you have created is now holding a value called India. And from the drop down menu, you can choose whichever country you want. Let us say I want to see the data for Philippines. Click OK. Click on apply changes. And then when you go to the table view, you will be able to see 5340 rows were loaded for a country called Philippines. So in effect, instead of loading 1 million rows and then filtering the countries using a slicer, I am completely reducing the size of my model by creating a parameter. So this is a very simple activity. Just to give a summation, I have created a new query called country from the existing sales data table and then created a parameter. That is the end of this discussion. We can move to the next discussion in a minute. Okay, let us begin the next topic. Dbart is having a question. Hi Raja, do you have a method to see the results for more than one country? In the parameter example, you mentioned that a specific country can be selected by the user, but assume that I want to see the report simultaneously for 2 countries or 3 countries. Will that method work, or I should think about any other method? In addition, I should have the liberty of choosing the columns to be displayed in a report. Brilliant questions from Dbart, and let us see whether we have answers for these questions. And the answer is to create a dynamic report with a function. So what is the difference between a function and a parameter? We will have a quick check. When you create a parameter, you have the greatest ability to limit the amount of data getting loaded into the model. This helps to reduce the model size and in turn can help improve performance. However, a parameter will allow you to choose only one country from the given list. If you want to see the report for more than one country at a given time, what should you do? You need to create a custom function and invoke it in the Power Query editor. For this purpose, you may need a separate table that will store your preferred multiple values. In our example, the name of countries. Let us say I want to see the reports for Denmark, I want to see the reports for France as well as Italy. For that purpose, we need a separate table, something similar to the Excel table with the names of the countries. I can add or delete country names in this table. All such changes can be passed to the Power Query editor by refreshing the queries. If your requirement is to create reports for only one country, always you can use parameters. If you want to create a dynamic reports in which you may be required to see the reports for more than one country, it is a good idea to create a function. Creating a function is quite easy. We still need the parameter query that was created in the previous example. I now need to load the Excel table which holds the names of the 5 countries for which I want to create a report. I'll be creating a function and then I'll be invoking the function which will give me another table in which all the countries selected by me will be available, along with a table which can be expanded with required columns. The steps are available here. You please watch the video first and then come back and read the steps one by one. Have a look into the Power Query editor screen wherein you can see the parameter that was created in the previous example. Let us have a look into an Excel file in which I have a table called My List, currently holding the name of 5 different countries. So our intention is now to see a report in which data for all the 5 countries in this list should be available. And to do this, the first thing I need to do is I want to pull the Excel table into my Power BI model. So I go to my Power Query editor, click on New Source, Excel workbook called Country Names in my desktop, in which I have a table called My List. So I bring that to my Power Query editor. As of now, the recently brought query called My List sits idle without doing anything. Let me click on the sales data table, right click, and then use an option called Create Function. And I just need to give a name for this function. Please watch that there is a parameter called param country is being shown here because this parameter is associated with the sales data query. So I prefer to give a name like multiple countries. Click OK. You will now be able to watch that the function called multiple countries is created and it is grouped with the parameter and along with the sales data query. Rest of them are grouped in a different position. Anyways, let us not bother about that much at this point of time. The next thing I need to do is I need to click on the My List table, which you will be able to see in the screen now, and then click on Add Column, Invoke Custom Function. It is now asking you to give a column name. You need not have to give anything. Instead, come to the second option of identifying your function query. Using the drop-down menu, you will be able to see a place called multiple countries, which is the name of the function that you have recently created. Click on that. The column name is set to multiple countries and the parameter country is now trying to understand the names of the countries from the column called selected country. That's it. Our job is almost over. I simply have to say OK for that. And then I get a warning called information is required about data privacy. You might have seen about the data privacy in the previous part of this video. So I'm going to click on continue. The reason for this warning message is we tried to get data from a SQL server and now we are trying to connect the data along with a local file in my C drive. So it is a good idea to ensure that you check the privacy levels. You might have seen the privacy level information in the previous part of the video wherein you saw options like private, public, organizational, etc. when we were talking about getting data from a SQL server. For the sample demonstration, I'm going to ignore privacy levels for this particular file, but in real life, you need not have to do that. Probably you can check with your organizational policy and accordingly you can work. I'm now going to click on save. Prior to that, I want you to have a look into a place called My List, which is currently having an exclamation mark. And since I'm going to ignore privacy levels and hit save, you can now see that the exclamation mark is gone and I have the My List query showing one particular column called selected country in which all the 5 countries are available as per my Excel workbook, and I get another column called multiple countries, that is the name of the function that we have created. And this is in fact a table this table comes from your sales data query. You can now expand the buttons here to choose what columns you want. And you can either check this or uncheck this option called use original column names as prefix. I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to click OK. And the only thing you need to be very careful about this particular section is, after doing everything, just ensure that you check the column types. The profit column, which should have been a number, is considered as an alphanumeric value called ABC123. Similarly, the date column is also considered as an alphanumeric column called ABC123 data type. So I'm just going to select all the columns, hit on transform, then using an option called detect data type, they are now converted into proper data. Now, please be aware that the query called MyList is your final product, and the sales data query should be stopped from loading. So you need to uncheck the option called enable load, and when you click on close and apply, you will be able to see data for the selected 5 countries. I can click OK. Let me go back to the Excel sheet, add a country to the table, save the same. Then I try to go back to my Power BI, hit refresh. I can now see the 6 countries coming up. So that is the expectation from DBAT as well as many users. So a function is capable of giving you the flexibility of a parameter as well as the flexibility of writing a SQL code in terms of selecting only a few columns. So with a function, I'll be able to greatly reduce the size of my model by giving a flexibility for the user to choose whichever country he needs to see in the report and whichever columns he wants to see. So that is a very simple explanation about creating a function. Probably you can try to do something similar so that you can get a clear idea on this concept. Okay, let us begin the next topic. And this topic is a slightly advanced topic which will be the need of the industry. Assume that you have 2 databases in your SQL server, one for testing purpose and the other for production purpose. You will initially create reports with the tables from your test environment. After everything is found to be working fine, you want to switch to production environment. How can you do this seamlessly? The solution is to create a parameter in Power BI desktop to switch between the 2 different data sources. When you publish this report to Power BI services, you can use the parameters in the published report also, which will be covered in a future video. As of now, I am going to give a quick demo on the concept. You will be able to look at the screen to identify one database called CSN that holds a table called sales data. I have another database called CSN production, and that also holds sales data. So both these tables are same except for the number of rows in that. The test environment may have a lesser amount of rows for testing purpose, and the production environment will have the actual number of rows. So how do we create a parameter to switch between these 2 databases? Let me start with importing data from a SQL server, and I start with the database called CSN, and I'm going to use a direct query option. Hit OK, choosing the sales data table and then loading the data to the Power BI model. So all set, the data is now loaded. I'm going to create a simple card in which I will pull the profit value. The profit value is 62.59 billion for the table in my database called CSN. Now, I prefer to do what? Prefer to create a parameter. To create a parameter, I need to go to my Power Query editor, click on sales data, click on manage parameter, new parameter, which I would like to call as param database, which should be a text. And for the suggested values, I'm going to create them manually. The first database is called CSN and the second one is called CSN production, and the default value is CSN and the current value can also be CSN. So I need to ensure that I spell the name correctly here. Let me have a quick check. It is called CSN-production, hopefully correct. Click OK, and you have just created a parameter for switching databases. And then I can reach my transform data, click on data source settings and then click on the option called change source, wherein the current database I want to use not the text called CSN, I want to use the parameter called param database. I click OK for that. I can close this, apply changes, and you can see the profit value 62.59 billion that comes from a database called CSN from a table called sales data. And if I can click on edit parameters to choose CSN production, click OK, click apply changes, you can see the value has changed, which means now I am connecting to the sales data table in another database called CSN production. And if I have created multiple pages of reports, all of them will be talking about the data from the production environment. So this is a simple demonstration. Okay, let us move to the next topic about getting data from Azure Analysis Services. Azure Analysis Services is a fully managed platform as service, which is known as PaaS or PaaS, that provides enterprise-grade data models in the cloud. It is almost similar to get data from a SQL server in terms of authentication, picking the model, selecting which tables you need. There is one difference between them. The connectivity mode is called import and connect live here. It was import and direct query in a SQL server. In Azure Analysis Service, it is called import or connect live. Azure Analysis Services uses the tabular model and DAX to build calculations similar to Power BI. The notable differences between Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server are Analysis Services models have calculations already created. If you don't need an entire table, you can query the data directly instead of using a transact SQL or TSQL to query the data like you would do in a SQL server. You can use multi-dimensional expressions known as MDX or data analysis expressions DAX. Using the connect live option helps you keep the data and DAX calculations in their original location without having to import them all into Power BI, which definitely is something really good and great. I have kept one plain Power BI file open in my desktop. Would like to connect to my Azure Analysis Services. Click connect, and similar to any other external data source, I need to authenticate myself here. So I'm going to get the server name of my Azure Analysis Services and then paste it here. Click OK, and I need to authenticate myself. If this is the first time I'm connecting to this source, I can do so using my Microsoft account, and it is done. And I'll be connected to Azure Analysis Services, and I can use the sample database called AdventureWorks, and I have a model. So this is the major difference. You don't see tables with the rows and columns, you completely see the model over there. And when you pull the model, you can see all the tables available here. When you go to the model view, you will be able to see them properly connected. So there is going to be no cleaning, shaping or transforming data, and everything is already done. You can even see a calendar table built in available with the model. That was a simple introduction to connect with the Azure Analysis Services. Let me quickly show yet another demonstration. When I pull data from a SQL server and I am trying to do a couple of activities in my Power Query editor. So assume that you are performing a couple of steps and then somebody is reporting that there are issues with your database. You will be able to diagnose by clicking on the Tools tab. Then you can click on something called a Start Diagnostics. And then you will perform the same activity. I'm going to cancel this action called Inserted Year. I click on Date, then go to my Add column, asking for the year value out of that. And then I click on the Tools. I then stop Diagnostics. So the diagnostics that was being run in the background will now give you some information about which step has taken what time. And you will be able to check if any of those transformation steps have taken a huge amount of time. And then probably you can consider creating a SQL query for that purpose or a view for that purpose, so that you don't do that activity in Power BI. That will be done in the native place of the source data. So that is a simple introduction about using the diagnostic options, which you should be aware of. We have almost reached the end of this video. though we are going to begin a new topic. And the next topic is about fixing performance issues, for which I have collated the points and given them in terms of 4 slides that you may read. Of course, this particular step called doing a diagnostic activity was given to you as a demo. Similar to that, there could be data input errors, for which you should have some idea on the points given in these 2 slides. Thanks to everyone for watching this video. See you all in our next video.